what does good Agile look like?
Are we shipping faster than we learn or learning faster than we ship?
The big con of Agile is it is susceptible to strategy drift, to noise, to pancaking, to distraction.
If you are practicing Agile theater, you are practicing a cargo cult, you are not going to get the results you want.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode. In-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm John Cutler.
And in today's episode, we're delighted to be joined by friend of the pod, John Cutler, to talk about Agile, Waterfall, what they mean, the pros and the cons of each, and what does it mean to do Agile well versus badly. This is a really important topic. Agile is a topic that we feel has so much confusion, so much BS around it, and yet it's a core part of how a good startup can work. So we are really here to help peel away the layers and tell you how to do Agile right. You don't want to miss this one. It's short, sweet, and full of value. Can't wait to take you through it right after the break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's vanta.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Welcome back. Just before we jump in and talk about Agile, Waterfall, and how it applies to you, I wanted to remind you all about the Startup Podcast Pact. We're growing. We're getting so much wonderful feedback from all of you, our lovely listeners, about the value that we're adding and helping you with your startups. It means so much to us. And what we would love to do is to be able to help more founders. That's where you come in. The best way we found to get new listeners, to have you all help us by following us in your favorite listening app and on YouTube, giving us a review, particularly on Apple Podcasts. A 5-star review with a little bit of written text makes a huge difference. And giving us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have your audience. It makes a huge difference. It helps us keep doing this, and it allows us to get the best guests and the best topics. Thanks so much for your help. Now, let's jump in.
All right, Yaniv. Today's episode, we wanted to talk about Agile versus Waterfall. I think some in the audience, very few probably, are wondering, what the hell are these guys talking about? Are we talking about exercising? Are we talking about nature? Are we talking about beautiful water features? What's going on, boys? So first, let's define Agile and Waterfall and discuss some of the pros and cons, which one maybe you should pick for your engineering product development, and maybe some of our hot takes in terms of which one we think is better.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one, Chris. I think it's an interesting topic because, for the last 10, 15 years of software development has nearly been Agile good, Waterfall bad. This sort of sense that Waterfall is the past of how you build software and Agile is the future. And I think that's actually had a lot of negative effects because people have taken this as an article of faith instead of, as you say, understanding the pros and cons and when to use each tool in your toolkit and what are the fundamental assumptions underlying each. So I think let's just jump right into that. Starting with Agile. When we talk about Agile, what do we mean? What are those pros and cons?
It's become doctrine. It's become, part of the buzzwords of the startup ecosystem globally. We've all heard the terms MVP, iterations, sprints,
Scrum Masters, God, all this stuff.
Yes, exactly. All the words of Agile. People don't understand often where it comes from, why it's important, and what it's really all about. Agile is essentially, it's the process of building software in such a way that you figure out thin slices of value, thin slices of new features and capabilities, and you ship them in iterations, one after the other, to end users. And you learn along the way. So you ship, learn, iterate. This is very distinct from Waterfall, which is where you figure out all of the things you want your piece of software to do, gather all the requirements up front. You develop a detailed and typically multi tens or hundreds of pages document defining all of these details. and then you scope it out, you plan the project, and then you build it, and then you ship it 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 50 months later as one big solid piece. And so these are very, very different motions, right? That require very, very different processes and mindsets and patterns. And they're used and useful in very, very different ways. And of course, they have different pros and different cons. So let's go through some of those pros and cons, hey?
And I think as we do that, Chris, like one thing that, as you spoke about it, regular listeners will notice is that some of the description of Agile is very similar to how we talk about building a startup, which is about putting something out there, learning, iterating, but doing it in the market, not waiting years to build the perfect thing and launch it. And so there is a natural affinity between Agile methodologies and startups, but it's not always the case. And also, just because you think you're being Agile doesn't actually mean you're doing it right. So I think, as well as the pros and cons, it's a question of like, what does good Agile look like?
Yeah, that's right, actually. So let's include what does good and bad look like in the mix here. The pros of Agile, and this is all, of course, assuming you're doing it right, is that you get to deliver value as you go. So instead of spending 1, 2, 3, 10, 24 quarters building something and then delivering it to the market and seeing what happens and building enterprise value, you're delivering it in theory in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, and then iterating, and delivering each new piece of value quickly. Just as a matter of building your company, you get to see those gains earlier. The customers get to play with the software earlier, or parts of the software earlier, and you get to start selling earlier, and you get to start accruing that value earlier. And so it just allows you to deliver value to market more quickly, even though it may not be the complete picture, the complete story of what you're trying to build. Now, of course, the second pro, which is tightly related to this, is you get to learn more quickly and more iteratively. And so this is very, very good if you're in a space where you don't understand exactly what needs to get built and exactly how to solve the problem. You get to learn by putting these things quickly into market and then seeing how the market responds and then adapting, adjusting, delivering the next thing to market based on those learnings. And so you learn along the way.
And I think this is the key thing to me, Chris, and, at risk of jumping ahead, we'll talk about this in more detail, is that Agile is what you want to be doing if you are not certain about things, right? If you need to learn on the way because you don't know everything up front, you don't know how the market will react, you don't know how the features should work, you don't even know what your own priorities are going to be in 6 months, well, damn, then you better be in a situation where you're able to, in short cycles, build something, deliver value, learn, hopefully, and then do it again and do it again so that you are constantly route finding on your way. And I think that is absolutely key if you are in an environment of less certainty, because you're exploring, right? Learning and exploring is kind of two sides of the same coin here. And the way you actually learn is by having those tight feedback loops with your market, with your customers, with your users.
Maybe it's worth putting a really fine point on this, right? So often I think if you say it's about learning and finding and exploring, I think somebody who's coming from enterprise, who's coming from Waterfall would say, well, I spend a lot of time learning from my customers. I go out there and I do deep research and validation and investigation and figure out all of the nooks and crannies. And I don't understand what you mean. Why would I learn in public, right? It doesn't make any sense to me. But what we're saying here is that startups, by their very nature, are tackling problem domains that are difficult or unexplored. They're disrupting the status quo. The new status quo is unknown. And so asking customers what they want, gathering requirements based on their existing domain dogma or inertia is not the right answer. Validating through academic or bureaucratic or requirements gathering techniques doesn't get you to the right answer. And, the cliche example here is always if Henry Ford asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, whereas what you really needed was a car. Or if Steve Jobs asked people what they needed, they would have said a better netbook instead of an iPad. And so here you're saying my startup is about breaking the conventional wisdom, breaking with the past, and I need to learn how people respond when it's actually put in front of them, not when I ask them to think about it academically. Okay, now the cons of Agile, there's a tendency in my mind to kind of iterate your way to nowhere. Your customers ask for stuff and you're like, yeah, sure, okay, let's do that. Why not? The market gives you a little bit of feedback. The CEO gives you some feedback. The sales guy gives you some feedback. And the product team goes, oh yeah, well, we'll just do that in the next sprint. No worries. And so you end up doing these small iterative changes. And the risk, if you're doing it poorly, is that these changes kind of pancake the product strategy, open up new surface areas and features that are ill-maintained or ill-considered. It ends up being not really quite sure what the hell this product does and if it does anything particularly well. And so I call it iterating your way to nowhere. And so that is one of the possible risks and disadvantages of a kind of pure agile iterative approach.
Agile is important when you're operating in an environment of uncertainty, right? Where you have perhaps a North Star, you're not quite sure how to get there, you want to learn and iterate and so on. I actually believe that Agile is relatively inefficient if you do know what you're going to do. Like, we're going to talk about Waterfall in a moment, where you have a relatively clear idea of what you're trying to build. Like, let's imagine you're driving down an interstate motorway, right? It's flat, you're going for hundreds of miles, and what you're not going to do is stop every 15 minutes, pull over to the side and say, oh, are we still going in the right direction, right? You just put your pedal to the metal and you keep going, right? The assumption is that there is uncertainty, there is sort of a fog of war, and there are things that you need to learn along the way. And because of that, there needs to be quite a lot of conversation, quite a bit of awareness, and inability to batch over long periods. And I think, especially in startups, those assumptions are usually true, but I think it's worth stating that they're not always true. And so there is this level of inefficiency that comes from constant reevaluation of what you're building.
There's nothing in the Agile manifesto that says that you need to sit there and have a stand-up, a sprint demo. You need to do maybe the retrospective, like, hey, folks, how do you think this is going? And that's what I meant by cons by the book versus cons versus as practiced, right? So by the book, you could sit there as a team and be like, well, we don't really have a lot of risk to reduce here. And, there's a key risk here around whether this whole thing will integrate. So let's just make a point every couple of weeks to just see if we can integrate end to end on this. We'll get to the end of this and we need lightweight rituals to do it. And then let's say you're dealing with something really uncertain. You could ramp that up. You could pay more attention. You could do that. I think that the problem really begins for a lot of these teams that there's no introspection on the process itself. These teams commit to all these rituals. They commit to hours of rituals every 2 weeks. They commit to these weird names of roles. They commit to these weird dynamics on the team. And then that becomes the goal versus, hey, what do you think we're dealing with here? How often do we need to just smoke test this to make sure we're moving in the right direction? Oh, okay. And it used to be actually every 6 weeks. It used to be every 2 months. The sprint length used to be really long. And now what you see is it sort of ended up on 2 weeks, which is really funny because I think 2 weeks is a terrible length because when teams are really not all that effective, 2 weeks is too long. I do 1-day sprints. But for a team that's rolling, that's figured out its stuff and is just marching along, 2 weeks is too often. It's maybe 6 weeks or whatever to do that. So I think that that's the difference between the cons of Agile as just a general idea versus as practiced in many cases. That's something that comes to mind.
So that's a perfect segue, I think, because what we're getting into is, what does it mean to do Agile well and not well? So John, you've already touched on it, but Chris, what are some of your observations? What are some of the things you've seen in terms of what does it mean to do Agile well?
I think, John, you're drawing the distinction between Agile as a pure principle as defined and devised by the authors.
Yeah.
And then there is Agile as lived and experienced by most people most of the time. And I think for the purposes of today's episode, it's probably more about Agile as adopted versus Agile as envisaged. And so doing Agile well is having, in my mind, a clear sense of who the customer is, what the problem is, what the North Star of your startup is, and having discipline, having someone in the org who is the keeper of the flame, of the strategy, of the craft to say, you know what, you guys are just doing lots and lots of iterations to nowhere. And to say, this doesn't fit, this requirement doesn't fit, this requirement isn't necessary, this iteration is off track. And so in my mind, Agile requires, because there's so much introspection, there's so much reevaluation along the way, it requires a great deal of discipline to stay on trajectory. The clearest example, we've mentioned it many times on our show, is MVP pivot. It's well, Chris, we launched our MVP, that didn't work. So we tried this other thing and that didn't work. We tried this other thing and it didn't work. It's no, stop. The idea is you ship your MVP and then you learn and then you polish and then you iterate and you make it work unless, you discover or decide that it's not going to. And so I think that's the big con of Agile is it is susceptible to strategy drift, to noise, to pancaking, to distraction, because there's so much of that existential introspection that goes along at every step.
I think a good question that you can ask is something that Tanner McGrath, when I was at Amplitude, asked, which is, are you shipping faster than you learn or learning faster than you ship? It's a really, really good question.
I like that.
Because basically, there are a lot of these big companies that really just can't ship anything for jack shit. It takes months and months to get anything done. Like, they would benefit from working smaller. And they've just accumulated a lot of learning. And they just need to figure out the shipping side of it. However, I'd say in the Valley, for example, there's tons of companies that are shipping way faster than they're learning. They're actually shipping way faster. They need to learn more and they're not learning maybe as fast. The other analogy there is like, think big, work small. Some teams are amazing at working small, but can't think big to save their life. Some teams only think big, but can't work small to save their life. So I'd say for any startup founder, the way to think of it is like, are we shipping faster than we learn or learning faster than we ship? Or are we working small and thinking big? Or are we just thinking big, working big, not getting anything done? And like, that's a good guide for you to say like how much to ramp up that level of discipline at the moment. And the problem, of course, is it's hard to know in the moment. You get wrapped up in where like the teams that can ship so fast, they get almost intoxicated with their ability to deliver quickly, that they're much more liable to iterate to nowhere. However, I'd rather have a team that can ship small and teach them how to think big than a team that can't ship small, because it's way better to be able to just ship quickly.
That's actually a really profound insight, shipping faster than you learn or learning faster than you ship. And so like when I think of like the ways that Agile can go off the rails, I think of like two categories of things, right? That each of you have actually already touched on. The first is that lack of direction. The idea that just because you are agile doesn't mean you don't have a goal, that you don't have a destination. That's when you are shipping faster than you learn. You're just like, damn it, like we're agile, it feels great, my joints are limber, we're just going to ship.
You're thinking small, working small.
Which is another way of saying, we don't know where we're going. We're just going to ship a bunch of shit, right? And it's like, we're going to keep going and it feels good to ship. Like you said, it can be intoxicating. And so I think that's sort of what you're talking about, Chris, when you say iterating to nowhere. Just because you've got a 2-week sprint or even a 6-week sprint, you also need a strategy. You also need a 1-year or a 2-year goal or something like, where the hell are we going? What is our customer? And all of that strategic thinking, being agile does not mean you don't have a strategy. So that's the first bucket. And then the other bucket, which I think you touched on in the cons, John, is the process orientation. Again, Agile is a philosophy. There's an Agile manifesto. But when people say doing Agile, what they mean is they are attempting to embody those Agile principles in a way of working. And what can happen, and what very, very often does happen, is that people focus on the process without thinking about the underlying philosophy and principles from which the process is derived.
Or the overarching strategy to which the process is supposed to be driving them to.
That's right. So you can call that agile theater where, again, and this is what a lot of the so-called agile transformations of big enterprises do, right? It's like, okay, we're going to have squads and scrum masters and sprints and retros and all this stuff, but we're not actually agile in the sense of learning from our customers and iterating and being able to change direction. No, we're just taking a big program of work and applying a different set of rituals. And worse than that, because you're actually still effectively doing Waterfall, you're not actually being agile, you're applying the wrong set of rituals, the wrong set of processes. There is a mismatch between your underlying philosophy and the processes you're applying. So you're doing this agile theater and it's incredibly inefficient and it's incredibly frustrating for everyone involved. So those are the two big buckets that I see.
That's the part that's crazy. I mean, a beautiful statement. Ron Jeffries, he writes his post. He's like, I may have invented story points. I regret ever having done that. You need to rewind 20 years ago when we're a bunch of everyone just like you. We're sitting around and thinking about how to solve a problem. And someone's like, hey, you know what? Ours aren't really working for us. Why don't we just try to think of something like this? And they did it. They experimented with it to do it. And so this whole agile industrial complex with things like Scrum certifications and all this kind of stuff, where the whole premise of that is you can act your way into this. That if you just if you paint by numbers and go through the motions, you'll somehow learn how to do all this stuff. Most of those people who were active in the mid-2000s around XP and even earlier Scrum stuff, a lot of those people have just disassociated themselves with Scrum, disassociated themselves with SAFe. Like Joshua Kiriesky, who wrote a couple books around agility, is just like, It's just not like that. And so it's just kind of weird at the moment. I don't know. It's almost like remnants of some bygone era that never really existed that people think exists. So it's pretty funny.
It reminds me of dogma, acting on the benefits of other people's thinking. It reminds me of what Steve Jobs said, is when you look around the world and you realize most of what you see was invented by people not much smarter than you, just trying to solve the problem that they had in front of them with imperfect information and imperfect craft, right? And so what's happened is these things that were some people sitting around in a room trying to solve a problem have been adopted whole cloth, either by name or by philosophy, or actually deeply transforming their companies around it. And the adoption has been done without understanding or without doing it well. We've sort of kind of jumped to the punchline of the episode, the reason I wanted to have the discussion in the first place. And so I think we should just lean into this. What I wanted to talk about was really this idea that waterfall is when the problem domain is well understood and the requirements are well understood, and you don't want to stop every 5 minutes, Yaniv, to your point, to figure out where you're going, because where you're going is straight. Really where I wanted to land on today's episode is for a startup that is exploring a domain that needs to stop every little while and look around and listen and learn and iterate. You need a North Star. You need a sense of where you're going. One that is like waterfall-esque, meaning here is our vision for where this thing could go, the kind of problems it could solve, the things that we think are within the domain versus outside of the domain. I personally like to describe and design that in quite a lot of vivid detail, maybe more than most would like or are comfortable with, and then figure out the agile iterations and the learning along that way. And so, again, the episode really, the punchline was intended to be really Wagile, right? Like a little bit of waterfall to understand where it's headed in theory, because you're going to course correct, and then agile to get you there in iterative learning value creation. And so I think if you do agile well, which is the question we're sort of answering at this moment in the show, I think you're doing it with a little flavor, a little spice of waterfall thrown in, which is a lot of strategy and a little bit of ideation and vision about where this could go.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
There's a great book out now called How Big Things Get Done. And I'll suppose waterfall never existed. Because if you look at this book, it talks about mega projects. We're talking about like nuclear power plants, solar arrays, Heathrow Airport, and other things. There's this great line in it where it's basically like, think slow, act very, very fast. And he talks about Pixar planning, which is basically like a rehearsal-based type planning. And in addition to the fact that like modularized big projects tend to work better, so solar arrays work better because you can build them and then just assemble them. Nuclear power plants are the worst. But he talks about like the things that help you do big things. And it's not so dissimilar from this idea of like, you can think very cheaply. So think as long as you want, do that thing. And then the idea is act incredibly fast. Because the longer something takes, the more entropy comes into play, the more the government will change. Like CalRail is a great example in California he brings up, where it's like, it's the endless project. It's never going to get done because governments change faster than it takes process to do CalRail to do the thing. And what I like about that book is it shows we've kind of mythologized this idea of waterfall as just a placeholder for sort of slowing down and thinking. And he's like, if you look at modern industrial, the massive billion-dollar projects in the world, they're not doing waterfall as plan everything up front. They're thinking very deeply about it. They're getting a lot of people to rehearse it and to pressure test it, iteratively design it, and then act as humanly possible. So the planning phase is a thinking phase. It's not a pulling shit out of the hat phase or, just making stuff up. And I found that to be just incredibly, they talk about Pixar planning at Pixar and Creativity Inc. It's like they meet every Friday and review the dailies from the movies they're making at Pixar, but they do a lot of their thinking in drawing and sketches before they go and they spend millions of dollars to produce the movie. So it's just like a very inspiring thing that matches what you're saying.
I see what you've done here, Chris, which is very clever, right? Which is you've set up this conversation as a bit of a Trojan horse to get us to this point, which is really, this is an episode about planning, right? And John, I think you've put a fine point on this, right? Which is, and again, there's a couple of famous military quotes, I think, that illustrate this pretty well, that work well in tandem, right? Which is, no strategy survives first contact with the enemy. And then I think there was one from MacArthur, which is like, the plan is nothing, but planning is everything, right? And I think all of this is saying, okay, you know what? Here's the situation. We have a problem we want to solve. We have a business we want to build. We should do a lot of thinking. We should, to your point, Chris, like actually establish a vision. Like I've heard this referred to as a product vision. Like, let's talk about how we think our product should work in 3 years from now. And you can do lovely Figma things and all of that. And like, this is how it should work. This is our vision for the product. We've got this great plan. All of that thinking is incredibly valuable. What is nearly guaranteed is that whatever you do is not going to follow that plan. But it doesn't mean the plan wasn't valuable, right? What it means is you can now be agile, but you kind of know where you're headed and you can course correct along the way. It's called course correcting, by the way, because you have a course. You cannot course correct off nothing. And so like, I think it's really about saying, you know, you can call it Wagile, but this is about actually saying, let's have a strategy, let's have a plan, let's have a course, let's have a vision. And then because no plan survives first contact with the enemy, let's make sure we have frequent contact with the enemy, which is in this case simply the world and our customers and our stakeholders, and adjust as that contact takes place. If you build this thing in an ivory tower under a bell jar and then release it once it's done, well, you have failed to learn from the reality on the ground. And, you know, just one other military quote, and I'll stop, is the map is not the terrain. So you got to get yourself on the ground.
To go back to the point about using Figma to design your product vision, I often will have, broadly speaking, 2 tracks when I'm running product or product strategy for a startup that I'm advising. One is the blue sky ideation track, where I am in really high fidelity to a degree that most people are not comfortable with and probably would deride me for, figuring out like, where is this product going and what does it look like in 12 or 24 months? And then a second track where we are digesting those ideas as a series of iterative, agile releases. And of course, learning along the way. I'm trying to think of what are the primitives, what are the UX surfaces, what are the UX metaphors, what are the core ideas, and then, you know, slicing that down into thin slices. And I just find this is so important. Call it Wagile, call it strategy, call it thinking slow and acting fast. I find that it pulls the future into the present way faster, because people start acting, they start skating to where the puck is going versus this weird incrementalism that doesn't get you anywhere. They start to, you know, ship releases more quickly because they're excited to get to that future. You get to show your customers and the sales team where you're headed so that they can start asking along that vector instead of in other different vectors. It's just so powerful. And the other thing I also do in that process is I say to people, put aside the regulatory constraints, put aside the technical constraints, put aside your domain dogma. What are the first principles, best practices, user-centric thing we can imagine? And so it has that added benefit of forgetting the scope and whatever, and just focusing on the user experience and where you want to end up and getting there as quickly as possible. Now, of course, that's an art, because you don't want to imagine 64 months out where you're imagining science fiction, but you do want to be out ahead of that curve, breaking the ice.
We did that at Amplitude, actually. The design team, every year in the fall, the design and product team would almost do like a vision exercise.
Yeah.
And it would be sort of like, what could the life of our customers be like with evolving the product in certain ways? And one of the interesting things is, we threw it all away after we did that. Like, it was literally there to serve as a kind of direction. We didn't throw it all away, but like, it was there to inspire. It didn't, it inspired the sales team about people directionally where we're going, but it was hard to like point and say, oh, they're going to build that one thing they've promised to build. And it did focus on the customers. Like, what would it be like? We would role play, and we'd actually do it almost as like you're watching a customer use the product to achieve some goal of theirs. It was kind of like a crafted video that people would watch typically at our all hands, or we do these kickoffs in the spring and we would play that video for people. And it had a really amazing unifying effect on the team. But to your point, it made something real in a way that's very difficult to make real when you're just cranking stuff out every week. It was really useful. It was a useful exercise. It's cheap. I mean, relatively cheap. We didn't have to build anything to make it happen.
Well, it's way cheaper than stumbling around in the dark, building shit that's, off trajectory, right? It's very cheap compared to all that.
Let me try to condense a few lessons that I think we're saying that people should draw from here, right? One is, do not use Agile as an excuse not to have a plan, not to have a strategy, but also not to have a vision. Like, there's an interesting thing. We talk about North Stars, like a lot of companies talk about North Stars, and it's nearly always a metric. We say, oh, we have our North Star metric. A metric is not enough. That is not a strategy. It is not a vision, right? A metric is saying, okay, this is the value we want to deliver into the world, but not how we're going to deliver that value. And so I think this product vision, which actually we haven't ever done an episode on, Chris, a strange omission, this idea of saying, let's paint what the future of our product looks like, is an important North Star as well. The term is not often used that way, but that is part of the North Star, right? This is the direction. Again, this is the course that we're on. We will course correct. It's not the exact course we're going to take, but we know this is the direction that we are headed. And it gives us that stability such that we can be agile in the face of learnings and obstacles and so on, but we are agile in a direction, right? We have a vector. We're not just stumbling around all over the place.
We did do an episode about acting from the ideal and working backwards. And to my mind, this is actually directly related to that.
Yeah, okay.
It's the kind of the more abstract or generalized version of what we're talking about here, which is understanding the ideal, understanding the vision, understanding the future state, and then connecting the dots backwards. In this case, very specifically applied to product and engineering cadence and processes and ways of working.
Yeah, just fun examples that people could relate to. I worked at a company called Appfolio. It was like property management. We had a vision called rent roll on the beach. And the idea is that one day, if you were a property manager, you could be in Cabo San Lucas or wherever, you could be on the beach in Tahiti, and you could just do your rent roll. You could just do all your accounting from the beach. And we made this whole vision for it. To the point, though, that stuff comes true eventually. A couple years later, we evolved the mobile product. We kept evolving it. We kept simplifying. They kept improving the product. And there was literally customer feedback like, I was able to use your mobile app and run rent roll from the beach. So I would add on to that. It's not just what your product would be like. It's imagining a world of what your customers' lives would be like using your product, because these were like, if you're running a property management, you can maybe manage your own 3 properties, but at the point of about 15, it becomes a full-time job. It's kind of thankless. You're not the property owner, or maybe you are, but 15 properties is a lot. It's hard to do it as an individual operator. But if you could make it so easy that you could manage 15 properties and run your rent roll on the beach, there's strategy baked into that. There's a customer segment baked into that. It's not the massive corporate property manager. It's a single person. So just think how powerful that can be for your company. It doesn't need to be just showing your product. It's like literally make a video about what your customers' lives might be like in the evolution of your product, and it goes a long way.
This makes me think of user stories, right? Which is, again, another Scrum or Agile term that gets terribly abused. Because what we're talking about here is an overall story of the user journey. It's very user-centric. And so this just brings me to, I think, the second big theme that we've covered here, just to wrap up, is that if you are adopting some sort of Agile methodology, whether it's Scrum or anything else, and has all of these routines and rituals, and you don't understand why you are doing those things, how they fit into this process of agility, then you are practicing Agile theater, you are practicing a cargo cult, you are not going to get the results you want. If user stories are just reskinned requirements, if sprints are just like these sort of planning units that don't have any correspondence to value, you are wasting your time, you're wasting your energy, you're driving everyone crazy, and you fundamentally are not Agile. So I think those are the 2 big lessons we want you to draw from here today. Agile is not an excuse for not having a plan. Agile rituals without understanding the underlying principles of what it means to be Agile is just a waste of time.
All right, guys, awesome. I think we landed on the core message of the episode. Have a plan, have a strategy, iterate your way to somewhere, not nowhere, and create value along the way. John, how can people find you on the internet if they want to follow up with you?
LinkedIn's a good place for now. I have a newsletter called The Beautiful Mess. Subscribe or find me on LinkedIn. It's a good bet.
Awesome. And Yaniv?
I'm mostly on LinkedIn, so find me there. I try to make it a bit less boring. I love getting connections from TSP listeners, so just let me know that's how you found me, and I'd be happy to be connected. And Chris, how about you?
I'm going to follow the LinkedIn crowd. The peer pressure is getting to me. Find me on LinkedIn as Chris Saad, or all the social media, or also on chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/newsletter.
Great episode. Thanks so much for jumping on, John. Really enjoyed having you on the show today.
Yeah, no problem.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.